On the 5th of December 1941, a Spitfire of the Royal Air Force's Photo Reconnaissance Unit flew low and fast over the English Channel. Its pilot was about to take one of the most historic photographs of the Second World War. It provided British scientific intelligence with its first glimpse of a secret German radar array. When this remarkable photograph was analyzed, it led to the mounting of a daring airborne raid, the first by British paratroops in the war, on the German radar station near Bruneval in northern France. The Bruneval raid, as it became known, was a key moment in the secret and deadly war waged between British scientific intelligence and its counterpart in Germany. It was also a testimony to the courage and training of a new fighting elite, the British 1st Airborne Division. By the autumn of 1943, Allied bombers had set Germany's cities ablaze. The air defenses of Hitler's Fortress Europe were beginning to buckle. They were still capable of inflicting heavy punishment on the Allied bombers, but they were being tested to destruction. The radar war was one of the key battlegrounds of World War II. It was fought on an electronic battlefield, in which small margins of error could mean the difference between defeat and victory. Radar was a weapon of attack and defense. Each new development was followed by enemy countermeasures. In the radar war, the bonds which bound the scientific backroom boys to the men in the front line grew ever tighter. The squiggles on the screen meant life or death to the men in the sky. Without radar, the Battle of Britain and the whole war might have been lost in the high summer of 1940. It provided RAF Fighter Command with the means to defeat the Luftwaffe by the narrowest of margins. And within 2 years, a burst of breakneck scientific development gave Bomber Command the radar-assisted navigational means to hit back ever harder against Nazi Germany. In the mid-1930s, however, the picture looked bleak. The bomber, it seemed, would always get through. Whether it was one of the Italian warplanes attacking Haile Selassie's army of tribesmen in Ethiopia, mustard gas against muskets, or General Franco's nationalist air force in the Spanish Civil War, a dress rehearsal for the conflict which was to break out in September 1939. Air defenses were primitive. Among them, concrete walls, designed to pick up the sounds of approaching bombers. But a British scientist, Robert Watson Watt, was working on another method of detecting aircraft at long range. His work was the byproduct of an unsuccessful search for an electronic death ray. Watson Watt eventually focused on the transmission of pulses of radio energy to be reflected from their targets and detected on the ground. The first target detected by radio direction finding was a Hayford bomber flying on a specified course near the radio mast at Daventry in February 1935. One of the scientific team, Arnold Wilkins, recalled the result.
We began to see slight fluctuations in the line on the tube, and these increased as the bomber got nearer to us.
Research into radio direction finding, as the British then called it, was undertaken at the rambling Bawdsey Manor on the Suffolk coast. It was a very British affair, informal and often eccentric, but extremely effective. It also had the active support of the far-sighted Chief of Fighter Command, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, who quickly grasped the possibilities offered by radar. By the beginning of 1939, there were more than 30 radar stations, with their distinctive slender masts, strung along the British coastline and connected to Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory. In the spring of 1939, only months before the outbreak of war, their secrets were probed by the German airship Graf Zeppelin. But the Germans fatally underestimated the importance of the British radar system. Its existence enabled RAF Fighter Command to abandon the wasteful system of standing patrols and to reorganize the fighter defense system to meet the threat revealed on the chain home radar screens. Soon the threat would become reality. July 1940 saw the opening moves in the Battle of Britain. Radar plots of the incoming bomber formations were fed to Bentley Priory and then back down the chain of command. Fighters were scrambled to meet the threat and guided to their targets by ground controllers. When Spitfires and Hurricanes engaged the bomber streams, their final briefings were in many cases only seconds old. Radar technology had provided the British fighters with the narrow margin they needed to survive the first phase of the battle with the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe became ever more desperate, frantically switching from target to target in the search for Fighter Command's jugular. But the chain home system remained almost unscathed as the Battle of Britain moved through August and into September. Fighter Command's reserves of experienced pilots was running dangerously low. But the Luftwaffe had taken a terrible mauling. As the British had discovered early in the war, the cost of daylight bombing against well-armed fighters was too high. To survive, bombers would have to seek the cover of darkness. But this imposed a heavy burden on bomber crews. The bombers lacked the navigational technology to find their targets. Although the bomber chiefs would not admit it, at this stage in the war, night bombing was a hit-and-miss affair. But the Germans had stolen a march on the British. By 1939, their scientists had adapted the Lorentz blind landing system to provide bomber pilots with an electronic beam which they could ride to their targets. It was codenamed Knickerbein, or crooked leg. In Britain, Germany's wartime scientific program was being monitored by a young scientist, Dr. R.V. Jones, working at Air Intelligence. Jones was particularly concerned about the so-called Oslo Report, a document from an unknown informant received by the British Embassy in Norway in the early months of the war. It detailed a number of German scientific developments.
And most important for this particular story was the idea, what he called Fliegerentfernungsmessgeräte, a device for measuring the distance of an aircraft, for example, for bombing. Didn't talk about platform beams at all, but did mention this method of ranging whereby one sent out a modulated wave from a ground station up to the aircraft, relayed it back from the aircraft to the ground, and the delay in the transit time, the pilot could be told from the ground how far away he was.
Although not entirely accurate, it was an early indication of the Luftwaffe's Knickerbein beam. Jones's next clue was provided by the British codebreakers based at Bletchley Park. They had broken into the German Armed Forces code enciphered on the Enigma machine. On the 12th of June 1940, Jones was handed a short Bletchley decrypt sent by the German Flieger Corps based in France. This stated, "Cleve Knickerbein established at position 53 degrees 24 north and 1 degree west." Bletchley had given Jones a vital clue. The position in the Enigma message was a point in the British Midlands. Jones concluded that the Germans had a radio beam transmitter codenamed Knickerbein at Cleve in Germany. It had laid a beam across the heart of Britain, which specially equipped bombers could follow. More clues came from captured German aircrew. One of them boasted to his interrogator at Trent Hall that the British would not find the Knickerbein equipment. It was under their noses, but they would never recognize it. In this, he was wrong. Jones decided to examine the radio receiver in a Heinkel bomber, which had been shot down in a raid over the Firth of Forth. His instincts told Jones to go for the bomber's Lorentz blind landing system, fitted as standard in all Heinkels. Jones discovered that the Lorentz was far more sensitive than anything needed for blind landing. It was tuned to follow the Knickerbein beam. The next step was to track the beams from the ground and from the air. And Avro Anson of the RAF's blind landing unit was sent to locate and fly down the beam. The secrets of Knickerbein were revealed. The Anson found and flew along the first main beam, a deviation off the track being signaled by dots and dashes on the other. A second beam intersected with the first at a point where the plane's bombs were to be released. On the Anson's flight, the beams crossed over the Rolls-Royce Aero factory at Derby. The British immediately launched a program to jam the beams using hastily adapted hospital equipment. The Germans had not anticipated that the British would interfere with the Knickerbein beams, and its useful operational life proved short. But the German bomber chiefs were afraid to tell Hitler of the system's vulnerability and continued to use it. But they had another weapon up their sleeve. Captured German airmen had also revealed the existence of a second, more sophisticated blind bombing system, codenamed X-Gerät. The hunt was now on to find and disrupt the X system. The X system was a great improvement on Knickerbein, using 2 transmitting stations. Initially, it was assigned to a crack pathfinding unit, Kampfgruppe 100, which became operational in November 1939. A month later, 3 of KGR 100's Heinkels, carrying no bombs, flew several experimental X missions over London. But another Heinkel had been shot down on the south coast, and the waterlogged X system receiver retrieved. A second technical mystery had to be solved. In the autumn of 1940, KGR 100 was ready to act as a pathfinder in a night offensive on British war industry. Target number 53 in its plan of attack was the city of Coventry. KGR 100 was now expert in the use of the X system. 4 beams were used. The pilot flew along the main beam until he reached the first of 3 intersecting beams. This warned him that he was approaching the target. On passing the second beam, the observer activated a bombing clock. On crossing the third beam, the clock was set to release the bombs directly over the target. The X-Gerät equipment provided KGR 100 with an extremely sophisticated system in which the bombing clock combined with the beams to give accurate data on the bomber's speed over the ground, the key element in accurate bombing, once the aircraft was routed correctly over the target. On the night of the 14th of October 1940, Coventry and its factories were the target for KGR 100. The center of Coventry was devastated. 21 of its factories had been badly damaged and its utilities wrecked. Meanwhile, London was enduring a blitz that would last until the beginning of May 1941. Bomber Command responded by stepping up its night bombing offensive against Germany. First with twin-engined bombers, and from 1941 with more potent 4-engined heavy bombers. Now it was the turn of the German air defenses to respond to an offensive against the Third Reich cities and war industries. The roles had been reversed. R.V. Jones knew that sooner or later the Germans would discover, as had the British in the Blitz, that their night fighters would be dependent on radar. An understanding of the enemy's equipment, its strengths and weaknesses, would provide the key to combating the German night fighter defense system. This had been reorganized in the early winter of 1940 by General Josef Kammhuber, who had redeployed most of the German searchlight and anti-aircraft gun defenses into a line stretching from Schleswig-Holstein to Liège. An immensely able technical expert and organizer, Kammhuber began to build up a series of radar-controlled night fighter boxes, which were the German equivalent of the RAF's chain home system. Kammhuber dubbed the system Himmelbett, the bed in the sky. RAF Bomber Command were to pay him the compliment of calling it the Kammhuber line. The battle for control of the night skies had entered a new phase. Germany had originally developed radio aids as offensive weapons, while the British had integrated them into a highly effective fighter defense web. Now, British scientists were striving to incorporate radar into the Bomber Command night offensive, while their German opposite numbers were developing radar as a means of defending the Reich. Both sides were limited by the technology at their disposal, but as Jones recognized, the technical margin required to win mastery of the skies might, once again, be a narrow one. This was a backroom war of calculations and inspired hunches. Above all, intelligence could throw a beam of light onto the enemy's capabilities and intentions. To Jones, this technical battle seemed all-important. But its resonance grew fainter the higher one travelled up the chain of command. And Lord Cherwell, Prime Minister Winston Churchill's personal scientific advisor, remained convinced that the Germans did not possess radar. At Oxford University, Jones had been a pupil of Cherwell, then Professor Frederick Lindemann. The two men were set on a collision course. Evidence of German radar had been provided by the scuttling of the German battlecruiser Graf Spee off Montevideo. An inspection of the gutted warship revealed a radar array, but little attention was paid to this revelation in London. Following the invasion of France, it became clear that German radars had been brought up to the Channel coast. In July 1940, they detected a British destroyer, which was then sunk by the Luftwaffe. R.V. Jones knew that the code name for these radars was Freyer. Once more, the hunt was on.
Freyer was the Nordic Venus, and she had, I said, not merely sacrificed, but possibly massacred her honour to get possession of a magic necklace, which I think was called Brisingamen. And this was looked after for her by Heimdall, who was the watchman of the Nordic gods, who could see 100 miles by day and night. What better name, you see, for radar?
The task of finding the elusive Freyer fell to the RAF's Photo Reconnaissance Unit. Photo reconnaissance was still a relatively inexact science. The camera was placed behind the seat of the pilot, who was required to dive and fly past the object to be photographed. This would disappear under the aircraft's left wing, making it very difficult to judge the precise moment to fire the shutter when it reappeared. All this while maneuvering at treetop height at 300 miles per hour, and in all probability, under fire. At first, Freyer defied all attempts to find, let alone photograph it.
In November 1940, squadron leader Claude Wavell came along to see me. He was, by this time, recognized as my interpreter, or head of the radio interpretation section at Medmenham, and said, well, he'd hardly like showing me, but would I have a look? Because there was something odd. He'd found in a field northwest of Cherbourg 2 things about 20 feet in diameter, circles, which he thought, so it might be agricultural cow bins for feeding cattle, but nevertheless, there was something odd and I ought to have a look. And when I asked him the name of the village, which was next to them, he said it was Eauderville.
Jones's ears immediately pricked up. After a series of tantalizing glimpses of the suspected German radar array, Jones was rewarded with evidence of the elusive Fryer. This low, oblique photograph of Fryer was taken on the 22nd of February 1941 by Flying Officer W.K. Manifold. Confirming evidence of Fryer's function was provided by one of Jones's assistants, Derek Garrard, who had been seconded to him from the Telecommunications Research Establishment, then based at Swanage and later at Malvern. Garrard travelled down to the south coast on a personal mission. He took with him a radio receiver on which he was able to pick up Fryer transmissions and get rough bearings on them. They coincided with the array photographed by Manifold at Eau-de-Vie. For his pains, Garrard was briefly taken into custody as a suspected fifth colonist. Now Bletchley Park stepped into the picture for a second time. The codebreakers provided Jones with a report that Fryer equipment was being sent to German-occupied Romania, along with some as yet unidentified equipment which was codenamed Würzburg. Intelligence also received a map stolen by a Belgian resistance worker which showed a series of German radar stations and indicated their range. These were also associated with the nagging new name, Würzburg. Jones had already deduced that Fryer would be unable to judge the height of approaching aircraft. He concluded that this job would fall to the mysterious Würzburg. If, as Jones guessed, they operated together, it might be possible to calculate the extent of German radar cover by decoding overheard enemy plots of probing British reconnaissance aircraft.
But the question was, what did a Würzburg look like? It was probably smaller than a Fryer, which was difficult enough to photograph. How could we find one?
Had he but known it, Jones and his team had a clue to the identity of Würzburg in their possession. Würzburg had been installed on top of the massive flak towers which dominated the Berlin skyline. In May 1941, an American diplomat had taken a photograph of one of the Berlin Würzburgs, which was now in British hands. It would have confirmed Jones's guess that Würzburg would look like a circular electric fire. Nevertheless, photo reconnaissance and a stream of reports from resistance workers were enabling Jones and his team to build up a picture of the network of Würzburg installations in northern Europe. In the autumn of 1941, an RAF photo reconnaissance sortie had returned with pictures of a Fryer radar unit installed on a cliff top at Bruneval near Le Havre on the northern coast of France.
Now, there was at the station at Bruneval, which is north of Le Havre, on the coast here, there was indeed a Fryer station, and there was a path that led from the Fryers to a house on the cliffs, and the Fryers are down here. And my colleague Charles Frank spotted that the path, which seemed at first sight to go to the house, didn't go to the house. It stopped about 20 yards short, ending in a loop, and besides the loop was a dot. Again, far too small to be resolved, and even on this photograph, which is a much closer photograph than when he took it on, you still can hardly see it, even with a magnifying glass. But anyway, there it was, and Charles Frank said, "What's that?" And we decided that there was a sporting chance it was the radar equipment we were looking for.
The man chosen to find it was squadron leader Tony Hill. He succeeded.
And he came back with just two photographs, which are two of the great photographs of the war. Here was the house, there the road had come up to here, and this blob, you see, really was just like the electric bow fire. And he took one flying past it that way for us, and then he went past and took a side view as well. And, of course, these gave us our first real sight of a Würzburg.
Tony Hill had finally exposed the quarry R.V. Jones had been tracking so patiently and for so long. Jones was immediately struck by the exposed position of the Würzburg array. Could a commando raid be dispatched to seize the enemy radar? Although the Würzburg had been positioned on the top of a high and virtually sheer cliff, Jones's eye was drawn to the continuous slope which ran down from the array to a small beach only a few hundred yards away. The germ of an idea formed in his mind. Were the new British commandos the men for the job? They'd been formed in the aftermath of the Dunkirk evacuation as a means of carrying the war to the enemy in occupied Europe with a program of amphibious raids. The commandos hit their stride in March 1941 with a raid on the Lofoten Islands, about 125 miles off the coast of Norway, north of the Arctic Circle. About 300 British and 50 Norwegian troops landed with complete surprise and destroyed nearly 1 million gallons of fish oil and 18 factories. They took 250 prisoners and returned with some 300 Norwegian volunteers. In December 1941, there was a second raid on the Lofotens and an assault on the heavily defended Vargso Island, 100 miles north of Bergen. Although the commandos suffered heavy casualties on Vargso, both raids achieved the effect of diverting increasing numbers of German troops to the defense of Norway. The commandos had demonstrated their stamina, skill, and above all, their ruthless determination to execute the mission demanded of them. The proposal for a raid on Bruneval was passed from Air Intelligence to the headquarters of Combined Operations, whose chief was Lord Louis Mountbatten. But at the planning stage, it was decided not to use the commandos, but instead to employ paratroops for the raid on Bruneval. The view was that a frontal assault on the beach below the Würzburg installation might prove too costly. The paras would stand a better chance. The 1930s had seen the birth of the airborne concept as a means of inserting crack troops behind enemy lines. The Red Army was an early pioneer of this new type of warfare. Once airborne, the paratroops clambered from the fuselage of their giant bomber to cling hair-raisingly to lines strung at its wing roots. They then slid away into space. It was primitive, but it worked. Ironically, the Soviets mounted very few airborne operations during the Second World War. Germany led the way, using airborne troops during the invasion of Belgium and Holland, and then mounting an airborne assault on the Mediterranean island of Crete in May 1941. By this stage in the war, German airborne forces had expanded into a corps commanded by Colonel General Kurt Student. The Crete operation was successful. But Student's paratroops suffered heavy casualties at the hands of the island's British, Commonwealth and Greek defenders. 7th Air Division alone sustained over 50% casualties. Adolf Hitler deemed the conquest of Crete a Pyrrhic victory and cancelled plans for the airborne capture of the island of Malta. The first British paratroops had begun training at Manchester's Ringway Airport in the summer of 1940. The initial force of 500 men was to grow into the 1st Airborne Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Boy Browning. Two battalion of the division's 1st Parachute Brigade had begun to form in the autumn of 1941 to be ready for war by midsummer 1942. However, the men of the battalion had barely completed parachute training when, in January 1942, they were chosen for the special operation against the radar site at Bruneval. The brigade's 1st Battalion had been in existence for over a year, but the brigade's commander, Brigadier Richard Gale, was determined to demonstrate that all his battalions were ready for action at any time. Two Battalions C Company, which was to bear the brunt of the fighting, was 120 men strong and almost entirely made up of men from Scottish regiments, notably the Black Watch and Cameron Highlanders. A small contingent of London Scottish were dubbed the Piccadilly Allsorts. C Company's commander was a tough Cameronian, Major John Frost, who had seen action when British troops foiled a pro-Axis revolt in Iraq. C Company trained hard for what Frost later described as a combined operation par excellence, in which the RAF, Army and Royal Navy would all play their part. C Company would be joined on the raid by a technical expert, an RAF radar operator, Flight Sergeant C.W.H. Cox, a peacetime cinema projectionist who had never been in a ship or an aeroplane before. Now Cox was learning to jump out of Whitley bombers. It would be Cox's task to examine the Würzburg and, if possible, to dismantle its key units, once it had been captured by C Company. The raiding party was ready to go into action by the 20th of February 1942. It had endlessly rehearsed the raid, partly with the aid of a scale model made by the RAF's Photographic Interpretation Unit at Medmenham. But now the rehearsals were coming to an end. Soon the Para's adversaries would be the genuine article, not their comrades playing the part in a collection of captured German uniforms. The plan for the operation was simple, and its preparation aided by detailed reconnaissance undertaken by the French resistance. The paratroops were to be dropped in 3 components, inland from the Würzburg installation. The first, commanded by Frost, was to capture the villa and then cover the party tasked with dismantling the Würzburg. The second was to advance on the beach, where there were a number of German positions, clear them, and then hold a landing area. The job of the third party was to act as a rear guard and deal with any German intervention. It would be the job of Royal Navy landing craft to pick up the Paras and their precious cargo from the beach held by their comrades. Then they would head for home. Cox and his team of engineers would have to run a race against time if the secrets of the Würzburg were to be taken back to England. Of vital importance was the compartment behind the dish holding the critical equipment. After several anxious days of waiting for the weather to clear, the raid was fixed for the night of the 27th of February. Last-minute preparations went ahead. The raid was mounted from the airfield at Thruxton. The 120 Paras were emplaned in the bellies of 12 black-painted Whitleys, obsolete bombers affectionately known as flying barn doors. The Paras floated down to a soft landing in the snow. The only sound was that of the Whitleys flying home. Almost immediately, however, the plan began to unravel. 2 of the 4 sections tasked with eliminating the beach defences from the rear landed some distance from their drop zone and the wrong side of Bruneval village. After a rapid assessment of the situation by their leader, Lieutenant Ewan Charteris, the Paras set off at the double across the snow-bound landscape, bypassing the village to attack the beach defences from the rear. On the way, they encountered and dispatched a German patrol. Meanwhile, Frost's contingent was creeping towards the chateau, while Cox and his engineers headed for the radar, pulling trolleys over a series of barbed wire obstacles. When Frost and his men had reached and surrounded the chateau, he blew a whistle. Immediately, the night was split by tracer fire. Inside the chateau, the Paras found only 1 German soldier. Frost later recalled that he could now hear explosions, yells, and the sound of automatic fire coming from near the radar set. All hell had broken loose, although the volume of German fire was not as yet matched by any accuracy. Frost then detached some of his men to reinforce the Paras defending Cox and his party of engineers. The latter were now grappling with the innards of the Würzburg, while automatic fire whistled over their heads. Under a hail of bullets, Cox had been forced to rip most of the Würzburg's components out by sheer force. Flashlight photographs taken of the parts as they were removed produced even fiercer fire from the wood to the southeast of the radar. After only 10 minutes, Frost ordered his men to withdraw to the beach, whose defences were still resisting the Paras beach party. The Germans were subdued, but there was no sign of the Royal Navy. Their arrival had been delayed by the presence in the area of enemy E-boats. While Frost impatiently signalled the Navy flotilla through the mist with a lamp and very-lights, the Navy waited for the E-boat threat to move away. Then, as Frost prepared to deal with a German counterattack, the Navy's landing craft loomed through the mist. One of the signallers shouted to Frost through the din, "God bless the ruddy Navy, sir." Even then there was a sticky moment, as the approaching landing craft poured fire onto the cliff top, where some of the Paras were waiting to repel the anticipated German counterattack. The withdrawal from the beach did not go as planned. The wounded and the radar equipment were placed in one landing craft. Under fire, the men were crammed into the remaining 5. In the confusion, 2 of Frost's signallers were left behind. The Paras were then transferred to Navy gunboats in the anxious moments before the flotilla set sail for home. 2 men had been killed, and there were 6 missing, all of whom survived the war. The Paras had brought with them 2 German prisoners, one of whom was the Würzburg's operator. With the dawn came an escorting squadron of Spitfires, ready to thwart a last-ditch effort by the Luftwaffe to destroy the flotilla and its vital booty. But there was no sign of German fighters as the flotilla steamed towards Portsmouth, now guarded by destroyers which had arrived at speed, the strains of Rule Britannia blaring from their loudspeakers. As the flotilla approached Portsmouth, Major Frost came up on the gunboat's bridge. He had already been informed that Cox and his men had managed to bring back almost everything that was needed for a proper evaluation of Würzburg. 2 companies' mission had been a resounding success. But it was a strange feeling for the Paras, after weeks of secrecy and stealth, to find themselves in the limelight as they neared home. For the British people, the news of the Paras' successful raid proved a welcome boost to morale amid a succession of strategic disasters. Back in London, the captured Würzburg equipment was eagerly examined by R.V. Jones before being sent to the Telecommunications Research Establishment for detailed evaluation. This revealed the extreme limits of the wavelengths to which the radar could be tuned and confirmed that it had no built-in counter to jamming. Later, by examining the works numbers on the Würzburg's replacement components, R.V. Jones was able to calculate that the Germans were producing about 100 of these radars a month. The Bruneval Würzburg was an early unit, but the technology of later versions was clearly much the same. After this setback, the Germans might be expected to take countermeasures, but some of them proved to be counterproductive. Orders were issued that in future, radar installations were to be protected by barbed wire, which, as it happens, shows up well on aerial photographs. The hunt for Würzburgs did not end with the Bruneval raid. On the time-honored principle of locking the stable door after the horses bolted, the Germans proceeded to demolish the villa at Bruneval. But the RAF's photo reconnaissance unit was still probing for more links in the German radar chain.
And then we heard of another one in the Scheldt estuary around Domburg. And again, of course, we asked for Tony Hill to go out. And once again, he came back with two photographs. One, a side view, like this, nicely scaled with an operator standing by the side of it. And the other, a front view, like that.
The Bruneval raid had been a crucial opening move in the radar war, but it was only the beginning. Radar was to dominate Allied bombing operations until the moment when the Luftwaffe was finally battered into submission by the combined bombing offensive mounted by the British and Americans. It led the RAF's heavy bombers to their targets to achieve an accuracy and destructive power undreamt of in 1940, when the Luftwaffe ranged over London, Coventry, and Manchester. But radar also led German night fighters to the bomber streams which flew over the blacked-out German cities. Radar could help you find your target, or it could turn you into a target. But in the mid-war years, it provided Allied bombers with one of the principal means to hit back at the cities which housed German war industry. The policy of area bombing, devised by R.V. Jones's old sparring partner, Lord Cherwell, was not very pretty, but it carried the war back into the heart of Germany as no other could. Throughout, the pilots of Bomber Command had reason to be grateful for the countermeasures made possible by the Bruneval raid. Bruneval is the first battle honor inscribed on the drums of today's parachute regiment. It is a fitting memorial to the exploits of what was then an untried force. The Second World War was to take British paratroops to North Africa, Sicily, and D-Day. At Arnhem, Frost and the men of 2 Para covered themselves in glory. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine, the force of 500 men who had assembled in the summer of 1940 had grown into 2 divisions of elite troops. In 1940, the British had braced themselves for a German invasion. Now, British paratroops and their American counterparts were landing by parachute and glider on the eastern banks of the Rhine in one of the most smoothly executed airborne operations of the war. Germany was soon to face defeat, her cities ravaged from end to end by Allied bombers. Some of the seeds of victory had been sown in February 1942 by the gallant men of 2 Para during the raid on the Würzburg station at Bruneval.
Coming up on UK TV History, more secrets of World War II, how Hitler invaded America.